somewhere between 1965 and 1969, rock musicians stopped writing love songs and started wiring their instruments to their nervous systems. Guitars bent into shapes nobody had heard before. Lyrics stopped making polite sense. Recording studios stopped being factories and became laboratories, places where tape ran backward, orchestras played in chaos, and engineers worked through the night, chasing sounds that had no name yet. What poured out of those sessions didn't just fill radio airwaves. It rewired culture, fashion, protest, and the way a whole generation understood consciousness itself. These weren't songs. They were detonations. 10 recordings. 10 moments where a band walked into a room and walked out having changed something permanent. Some sold millions. Some never charted at all. But every one of them left a mark that still hasn't faded. And you can hear the evidence the moment the needle drops. This is where it started. No. 10 Magic Carpet Ride. Steppenwolf, 1968. John Kay wrote the song on a dare from the music itself. The title was The Map, The Destination, and The Warning all at once. Released in September 1968, Magic Carpet Ride hit American radio at a moment when the country was already burning assassinations, protests, a war that nobody could stop. Steppenwolf wasn't offering comfort. They were offering escape velocity. The song opened with a stretch of electronic distortion that felt genuinely alien, not polished, not safe, but like static from a transmission coming in from somewhere past the edge of the atmosphere. Then the band detonated the full track, and any listener still gripping the dashboard could let go. What separated Magic Carpet Ride from every other psychedelic experiment of the year was its refusal to choose sides. It had the haze and drift of the underground scene, but it carried hard rock muscle underneath, loud enough for arenas, strange enough for headphones at 2 a.m. Radio didn't know what category to file it under. They played it anyway. It clawed its way to the top 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and never left the cultural conversation after that. Before the track fully pulls you in, before the guitars lock and the electronics spiral, Kay opens his mouth, and what he delivers isn't a lyric so much as a confession whispered from somewhere between waking and sleep. Those 4 words drop all the armor. After that whisper, the full band erupts around it, and the contrast is almost violent. The intimacy of one man's longing crushed under the weight of distorted guitars and studio-processed noise. That's the architecture of the song. Fragile at the center, ferocious at the edges. Decades later, the riff still lands in movies, car commercials, and classic rock playlists with the same authority it carried in 1968. Nobody needed to rehabilitate it. It never lost its edge to begin with. No. 9 Time of the Season. The Zombies, 1967. The band that recorded it had already broken up. Nobody bothered to tell the song. Rod Argent wrote Time of the Season during sessions for the Zombies' final album, Odyssey and Oracle, in 1967. The band had no money. They booked studio time late at night to cut costs. They recorded in borrowed hours and half-lit rooms, and somewhere in that financial desperation, they stumbled onto something that felt like it had always existed. The bass line, the breathing, the mood of a summer evening that's slightly too warm, slightly too quiet, slightly off in a way you can't identify until it's already under your skin. By the time the song charted, actually reaching the top 3 in America in 1968, the Zombies were gone. Argent had moved on. The other members had scattered. The hit that defined their legacy arrived after they'd already stopped existing as a band. That's not irony. That's a ghost story. The album Odyssey and Oracle sold 2 to 3 million copies worldwide over time, eventually landing on virtually every serious list of the greatest psychedelic records ever pressed. Critics called it visionary. Radio had largely ignored it on release. Both things were true simultaneously. What made the song impossible to shake wasn't any single element, it was the combination. Warm and sleepy and seductive, but with something cold underneath, something that made you feel watched. Very few recordings in rock history have managed to be romantic and unsettling at exactly the same time. The Zombies pulled it off while running on no budget and borrowed time. The song outlived the band by decades. It still sounds like a night you can't quite remember. No, Ate Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The Beatles, 1967. John Lennon's son, Julian, came home from school one afternoon in 1967 carrying a crayon drawing. It showed a girl floating among stars. He called it Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lennon sat down, looked at the drawing, and started writing. That's the official story. Everyone noticed something else immediately. The initials L.S.D. stacked up in that title like a neon sign. The Beatles denied it every time someone asked. McCartney denied it. Harrison denied it. Lennon denied it with the specific kind of exhausted patience that made people believe the opposite. Nobody could prove anything. Nobody had to. The song sounded like the inside of a mind that had dissolved its own edges. The lyrics weren't subtle about it either. Marmalade skies, cellophane flowers, newspaper taxis, girls with kaleidoscope eyes. These weren't images borrowed from surrealism textbooks. They felt extracted directly from a specific altered state, specific enough to be recognizable to anyone who'd been there, strange enough to terrify anyone who hadn't. Producer George Martin shaped the studio sessions with tape speed manipulation, layered instruments, and microphone techniques nobody had tried before. The result didn't sound like a recording. It sounded like hallucination pressed into vinyl. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band sold over 30 million copies worldwide and won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds became one of its most weaponized moments, the track that got the album banned from some radio stations while simultaneously guaranteeing every serious listener would seek it out. Prohibition has always been the best advertising. Was it a drug song? Was it a child's innocent drawing transformed into music? Lennon never settled the question. Maybe that was the point. No, 7 Dazed and Confused, Led Zeppelin, 1969. Jimmy Page played the guitar with a violin bow, in public, on a full stage, in front of thousands of people who had never seen anything like it. The song had a previous life. A folk musician named Jake Holmes had written and performed an earlier version in 1967. But when Led Zeppelin got hold of it for their debut album in 1969, what Holmes had built gently, Page and Robert Plant demolished and rebuilt as something that barely resembled the original. The bow technique alone transformed the guitar from an instrument into a threat, scraping long, sustained tones out of the strings that sounded less like music and more like something alive and in pain. Audiences stood still in a very specific way, the way people stand when they're not sure whether to run. Plant's vocals matched the atmosphere measure for measure. He didn't sing the lyrics, he screamed them from somewhere past the technical limits of his range, filling the spaces Page left open with pure terror and raw energy. The long instrumental sections weren't filler. They were the point. Live performances stretched past 20 minutes on some nights, the band navigating the song's dark architecture from memory while the crowd lost track of time entirely. Led Zeppelin's debut album sold over 10 million copies in America alone. Dazed and Confused proved something most rock musicians had refused to accept. Psychedelic music didn't have to be soft. It didn't have to be gentle or drifting or warm. It could be aggressive, physically confrontational, and still reach somewhere deeper than adrenaline. The song didn't just help build psychedelic rock. It helped construct the foundation of heavy metal. One track, two genres. The mathematics of influence rarely work that cleanly. Number 6. All Along the Watchtower, Jimi Hendrix Experience, 1968. Bob Dylan wrote the song in 1967. Then Jimi Hendrix took it and made Dylan feel like a cover artist in his own catalog. Hendrix recorded All Along the Watchtower for his Electric Ladyland album in 1968. Dylan's original was acoustic, spare a poet's sketch of apocalyptic imagery delivered with his characteristic flat precision. Hendrix heard something different inside it, something that needed volume, layers, and fire. He stacked multiple guitar tracks over each other until the song became a cathedral of sound rather than a single voice. Producer Eddie Kramer later described the sessions as relentless Hendrix, spending hours hunting for specific tones, adjusting effects, refusing to accept a guitar sound that didn't match the one he was hearing inside his head. The result was something neither folk nor rock could fully claim. The lyrics still carried Dylan's biblical weight riders, princes, plowmen, jokers, thieves, but Hendrix's playing turned those images into physical sensations. Every solo sounded simultaneously emotional and explosive, like grief and fury, occupying the same exact moment. The single became Hendrix's highest charting release in the United States. The album sold 8 to 10 million copies worldwide. Dylan himself admitted he preferred Hendrix's version to his own. That admission cost Dylan nothing. It confirmed everything. When the original author surrenders the song to the cover has become the definitive version. That's not a compliment. That's a reclassification. Many guitarists still rank All Along the Watchtower as one of the greatest guitar recordings ever committed to tape. The competition for that title is fierce. Hendrix holds it anyway. No, 5. When the Music's Over, The Doors, 1967. Jim Morrison didn't write pop songs, he wrote ceremonies. When the Music's Over arrived on Strange Days in 1967, running over 10 minutes long. No commercial single, no radio edit, no concession to the format that was making other bands rich. It was never intended for charts. It was intended for something harder to measure the specific experience of being inside a sound that has no interest in your comfort. The album sold 3 to 5 million copies worldwide, but the song lived outside those numbers entirely, passed from listener to listener through FM radio and live performances that felt less like concerts and more like rituals. The structure wasn't really a structure. It moved through quiet passages and sudden explosions, spoken word fragments and long instrumental stretches, Ray Manzarek's keyboards floating underneath everything like smoke present, but impossible to grab. Morrison treated his lyrics like dispatches from a mind that had pushed past every reasonable edge. Sometimes the audience couldn't decode what he meant. They felt it anyway. That gap between understanding and feeling was where Morrison lived. There are moments in that recording where the tension builds to something genuinely unbearable, where the quiet becomes louder than the noise, where every soft note feels like a threat. And then, from somewhere deep inside that pressure, Morrison's voice drops to almost nothing, and what surfaces doesn't explain itself.
Cancel my subscription to the reserve.
That line lands like a blade. No target named, no explanation offered, just the flat, total rejection of whatever contract the world had assumed was still in force. After those 3 words, the band reassembles around Morrison's silence, and the track pushes forward with renewed violence, as if the declaration itself had cleared space for something darker to enter. Morrison became a cultural icon. The Doors became one of the era's largest rock acts. When the Music's Over became one of their most uncompromising achievements, it never explained itself to anyone. It never had to. No more 4 Dark Star, Grateful Dead, 1968. No 2 performances were the same. That was the entire point. The Grateful Dead released the studio version of Dark Star in 1968, a short, deceptively conventional recording that gave almost no indication of what the song would become in their hands on a live stage. Live. Dark Star was not a song. It was a direction the band walked in every night, never arriving at the same place twice. Performances stretched past 30 minutes. Jazz folded into blues, folded into pure improvisation, folded into silence that lasted long enough to make the room uncomfortable, then resolved into something that sounded inevitable all along. Jerry Garcia's guitar didn't lead the band through Dark Star. It conversed with them. He played in questions and partial answers, leaving room for the other instruments to respond, building something collectively that none of them could have constructed alone. The famous live version on the album Live Dead became one of the defining psychedelic recordings of the era, not because it was polished, but because it documented something genuinely unrepeatable. A band trusting each other enough to walk into the dark without a map. Commercially, the Grateful Dead never matched the Beatles or the Doors in raw sales. Culturally, their influence accumulated like compound interest slowly. Then, all at once, they built an entire concert culture around improvisation, freedom, and community. Deadheads didn't follow a band. They followed an experience that kept reinventing itself. Dark Star was the purest distillation of that philosophy music that refused to be captured, preserved, or pinned down. No, 3 White Rabbit, Jefferson Airplane, 1967. Grace Slick wrote the song alone, after midnight, in 1966. One sitting, no edits. She'd been reading Lewis Carroll not casually, not for the first time, but as someone who recognized the internal logic of a mind that had dissolved its own rules. Jefferson Airplane released White Rabbit on Surrealistic Pillow in 1967, and the single sold 1 to 2 million copies at a time when psychedelic music was still largely underground. The album crossed 1 million copies worldwide and kept moving. A song built on a children's book had become one of the defining anthems of the counterculture. Carroll would not have been surprised. The architecture of the song is a single machine designed to create one experience, the feeling of descent. The bass line opens alone, slow and deliberate. The drums enter. The tension climbs. Slick's voice arrives calm, almost clinical, which is exactly why it unsettles. She isn't performing altered consciousness. She's reporting on it with the precision of someone who knows the territory intimately. And then, just before the track reaches its peak, before the final surge collapses the whole structure into that last stretched note, the lyric shifts, and Slick's voice carries something that isn't quite a demand and isn't quite a warning.
Pill makes you larger.
Those 3 words land differently depending on where you're standing. Physically larger, psychologically expanded. The song never explains which it means. What happens next is that the music doubles its intensity, and the listener is already committed. There's no stepping back from a wave that tall. Slick understood that the most powerful psychedelic art doesn't describe the experience. It replicates the mechanism. White Rabbit entered mainstream rock history as the first psychedelic song many ordinary radio listeners had consciously encountered. Not underground, not cult, chart radio, prime time, middle America. The walls had come down. There was no rebuilding them. No, A Day in the Life. The Beatles. 1967. The orchestra had one instruction. Start on your lowest note, end on your highest, and take 24 bars to get there. Do not coordinate with each other. George Martin delivered that directive to 40 classical musicians assembled at Abbey Road in February 1967. What they played back sounded like a civilization, collapsing in slow motion, every instrument climbing at its own pace, nobody in rhythm with anyone else, the noise building from murmur to chaos to something that transcended both. Lennon and McCartney had built the song from 2 separate fragments that had no obvious reason to fit together. Lennon brought the dreamy, disconnected verses, newspaper headlines, traffic jams, the blank numbness of modern life. McCartney added a burst of frenetic energy in the middle, a man rushing through his morning, late, barely holding the day together. Martin stitched them with that orchestral catastrophe. Then came the ending. One piano chord, actually several pianos, struck simultaneously, sustained for nearly a full minute, the resonance gradually fading until the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Nobody in rock music had ended a song that way. Nobody had considered it. After that chord resolved, nothing sounded the same. Sgt. Pepper's won Album of the Year at the Grammys. It sold 30 million copies. A Day in the Life collected every superlative the critical establishment possessed and kept accumulating more. But the statistics missed the point. The song captured something specific and difficult to articulate, the feeling of living in a world that generates more information than any mind can process, surrounded by noise that looks like meaning, moving through days that blur into each other until everything feels both vivid and numb simultaneously. 1967. The feeling has not aged. No One the End, The Doors, 1967. Jim Morrison originally wrote it as a breakup song. Then he kept going. By the time The End appeared on The Doors' debut album in 1967, the breakup was gone. What remained was 11 minutes and 43 seconds of something that resisted every normal description. Not psychedelic rock exactly, not spoken word exactly, not theater exactly, but all three simultaneously, pressing against each other until the boundaries dissolved. Robbie Krieger's guitar built the hypnotic, arid atmosphere, a sound like heat rising off desert pavement, going nowhere, in no hurry. Manzarek's keyboards floated underneath like an undertow, gentle and lethal. Morrison's voice moved through the track like a man walking through a dark room he doesn't recognize. The lyrics accumulated symbols the way a fever dream accumulates images: death, the ancient lake, the west, the blue bus, the snake, the father, the mother. Morrison never explained the sequence. During live performances, he sometimes improvised entirely new lines without warning, which meant nobody, including his bandmates, knew exactly what was coming. That unpredictability made the concerts feel genuinely dangerous. Audiences didn't just watch, they waited. The Doors' debut album took time to reach its full commercial momentum, but over the long arc of its life, it sold more than 10 million copies worldwide. The End was never going to be a radio single. It was something different, the kind of recording that doesn't sell. It converts. First listen, something shifts. Second listen, you stop trying to understand it and start trying to survive it. Years after its release, Francis Ford Coppola opened Apocalypse Now with The End playing over burning jungle and helicopter blades. 1979. A new generation encountered the song not as a relic, but as the perfect musical expression of civilizational unraveling. The song hadn't aged. The world had grown into it. Near the track's center, before the final escalation, Morrison's voice drops to a near whisper, the vocal equivalent of a door swinging open onto something you can't see yet. The surrounding silence becomes architectural. And then,
This is the end.
four words carrying the full weight of everything the previous 10 minutes built toward. After that declaration, the track doesn't collapse, it expands, like a final breath before submersion. The instrumentation spirals outward, while Morrison's voice rises toward something that sounds less like a performance and more like a genuine goodbye. There is no distance between the listener. That was always what psychedelic rock was reaching for. The 1960s broke open and poured out sounds that the decade before couldn't have conceived, and the decade after couldn't stop chasing. These musicians didn't polish their edges. They burned them off, deliberately challenging convention, destroying safety, demanding space for everything, too strange, too dark, too honest to fit anywhere else. Without these recordings, the architecture of modern rock looks completely different. The roads lead somewhere else. The destinations vanish. What they built wasn't meant to last. It was meant to detonate. 60 years later, the shockwave is still traveling.